Hello viewers and welcome to another episode of Elections by Numbers. Today we're talking about the Gem State, Idaho. Idaho contains the deepest river gorge in the entire country. It is called Hell's Canyon and it is deeper than even the Grand Canyon in Arizona. Hell's Canyon from the top to the river is about 8,000 foot descent versus the Grand Canyon's 6,000 foot descent. I also learned another weird law that exists this time in the state of Idaho. I learned that it is illegal for any citizen in the state to hand a bag of candy to another citizen that exceeds 50 pounds. So I guess if you're offloading inventory from a truck into a candy store, you have to lift it, set it down, then the next person lifts it up, etc. Don't hand it to the person directly. You might end up in jail. Idaho has two congressional House districts, and they are currently both represented by Republicans. And the two districts respectively have Cook Political Report Partisan Voting Index leans of plus 21 and plus 17 into the Republican column when compared to the national average. So based on those figures alone, I can say with a fair amount of certainty that neither is considered particularly competitive at this point in time. But just for the sake of consistency, let's take a look at a double line graph to see how citizens of Idaho have been electing their representatives in the U.S. House. Let's pull that up right now. And as expected from the partisan lean scores from Cook, we do see Republicans with a consistent advantage going back over the last 10 years, with minor fluctuations in between every other election cycle, depending on whether or not it is a presidential election year or a midterm election year. And both parties have slightly increased turnouts during those presidential years, but the difference is much more stark for the Republican Party, where they are largely separating themselves in terms of raw turnout numbers from the Democratic Party. Looking at this and coupling that with the Cook scores that we just mentioned earlier, I do believe Republicans are in a fairly good position within the Gem State as of right now. So let's toss that graph aside. And yes, I don't think either district is going to flip this year. Have not heard of any election predictors that have considered it to be remotely competitive at all within the state. So let's go ahead and make those results official. 2 seats in Idaho remaining in Republicans' hands. Let's put that on our first map right now. Mark it. Coming up next, we do have a Senate election in Idaho. Incumbent Republican Senator Jim Risch is running for his 3rd term this year, and his Democratic challenger is a woman named Paulette Jordan, who is a former member of the Idaho House of Representatives and was the gubernatorial candidate in the state 2 years ago during our most recent midterms. How have Idahoans been voting for senators over the last 10 years at least? Let's take a look at some voter turnout ratios right now to shed some light on that. And here we have some pretty revealing numbers indeed. We are comparing basically in these percentage values, these are comparing the amount of votes that senatorial candidates receive relative to all the U.S. House candidates running in the state that year from their respective parties. So Jim Risch, in his previous election, that was 2014, he received 4% more votes than the total of both Republican candidates running for both of Idaho's U.S. House seats that year. And in fact, going over the last 3 election cycles for Senate candidates, Republicans have never fallen below 100%, whereas Democratic senatorial candidates have never risen above 100%. Democrats' best performance at the senatorial level apparently was in 2014, which is peculiar because they pretty much got shellacked in Congress that year. But then their performance worsens in 2016, which was a presidential year, obviously. And we saw Republicans' performance worsen slightly that year as well. But of course, these are relative to raw House turnout numbers, so the Republican senatorial candidate won handily in the state that year in 2016. The upside for Democrats from this data is that Republicans are trending downward consistently, whereas Democrats' numbers are kind of bouncing up and down somewhat inconsistently over the last 10 years. But I do imagine there's still a ways forward to go for Democrats to have even a chance in winning a Senate seat in Idaho. So let's toss those numbers aside. We lastly have to consider the approval rating of the incumbent, in this case, Senator Jim Risch. He is enjoying a fairly positive, fairly great approval rating of plus 18 points in the state. So when you consider that along with Republicans' advantage in raw turnout numbers for House candidates and their advantages in those turnout ratios we were just looking at, this looks pretty good for Senator Risch. Let's turn to Pollbot to calculate exactly how much he's going to win by this year. Pollbot, let's take all that. Yeah. And there you have it, Senator Risch winning the state of Idaho again by a 23.72% margin of the vote over Democratic challenger Paulette Jordan. Idaho has been very kind to Republican congressional candidates and presidential candidates for a long time now, and the data suggests that that is not going to be changing anytime soon, and definitely not changing this year. So let's make that official, another Senate seat held by Republicans in 2020, and put it on our senatorial map. Mark it. Now it is time to talk about the presidential election of 2020, starring President Donald Trump and Democratic challenger Joe Biden. Idaho is a state that last voted for a Democratic presidential candidate, like many other heavily Republican states did, in 1964 when they broke for Lyndon Johnson over Republican challenger Barry Goldwater. So 56 years ago. It's been 56 years since Idaho has voted for a Democratic presidential candidate. That's a pretty long time. The state more recently elected Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton by a very, very healthy 32% margin of the vote. So Joe Biden certainly has his work ahead of him if he's serious about winning Idaho this year. To see how Idahoans have been voting for presidential candidates, let's take a look at some more voter turnout ratios right now. And as you can see, looking at these numbers, the advantage that Republicans are enjoying in this category is much less obvious than it was for senatorial candidates anyway. In fact, you might barely even call it an advantage at all. You go back to 2012, and Mitt Romney had about a 1% advantage over Barack Obama. Fast forward 4 years, and then Donald Trump's advantage shrinks to about half that, about a 0.5% advantage over Hillary Clinton in the state. What's more interesting from these numbers is that both candidates in 2012 had values higher than 100%, and then in 2016, both Clinton and Trump had values lower than 100%. So you're seeing candidates that were unpopular in both parties going from one election cycle to the next. In other words, Idahoans were just much more enthused to vote for Barack Obama and Mitt Romney than they were for either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump 4 years ago. The numbers are so similar between parties here that it's barely going to make a difference in our final calculations. So let's toss those numbers aside for now. And lastly, consider the approval rating of the incumbent, in this case, President Trump. He is currently at plus 15 points in terms of approval rating in the state, which is good. It's not quite as good as the score that Jim Risch got in the state, but it's certainly not going to hurt him in any way, already knowing how Idahoans turn out in terms of party identity during election years. So let's take everything we know, every factor, every variable, give it to Pollbot to calculate how this is going to go down in the presidential election in Idaho. Pollbot. And there's our answer. Donald Trump carrying the state in its 4 electoral college votes by 22.01% margin of the vote. This is a projected decrease of about 10%. Going from 2016 to 2020, which is pretty significant, although honestly, I wouldn't be surprised to see this margin of victory slightly higher than what we've projected so far. The windows of victory tend to narrow when they get more extreme, and Idaho is a state that I would consider to be among the most extreme in terms of how partisan it has historically voted. So 22% might be sort of the low end of how Trump could possibly perform. I don't expect him to hit 32% margin of victory again this time. Regardless, he's definitely going to carry the state, so let's make that official and put it on our presidential map now. Mark it. So now we have all the election results in for Idaho, and it's all very good news for Republicans. Let's talk briefly about the future of the state politically by looking at an old line graph and 2 new ones. So first, let's look again at the raw House turnout numbers that we saw in Idaho going back over the last decade. Look specifically at the slope values that you can see for both of those dotted lines that you can see in the graph. So for Republicans, it's that value of 24.7, and for Democrats, it's that value of 11.3. Basically, what that means is when you look at the last 10 years, Republicans have been adding an average of 24,700 votes to their candidates every 2 years, versus the Democrats' added voter count of 11,300 votes. So going back over the last 10 years, you've seen an average increase of about 13,000 votes, over 13,000 votes favoring Republicans, meaning that the Republican Party is still breaking away from the Democratic Party in Idaho at this point, in a state that is already very heavily Republican, as we've probably determined thus far. When we look at these other 2 line graphs next, first we're going to look at the senatorial to House voter ratios. These are estimates for the rate of increase or decrease in those values that I was using in my calculations. We do see Democrats starting out at a pretty noticeable disadvantage at the beginning beginning of the decade in terms of senatorial prospects, but making some progress to that end. We saw Republican candidates steadily declining in terms of their voter ratios going back over the last 10 years. And the Democrats' less consistent values that they've received over the last 10 years actually end up favoring them, but it's not nearly enough to make up for the deficit of just raw voters that turn out for Republicans in the state. So I wouldn't expect these estimates to make much of a difference in terms of breaking ties in elections until the state becomes much more competitive at the House level, which is certainly not happening yet. And then lastly, looking at the estimates for the rate of increase or exclusively decreases in the case of presidential to House voter ratios. Remember, we saw Idaho being much more enthusiastic to vote for either candidate in 2012 than they were for either candidate in 2016. That's why you have negative slopes for both of these lines. But not only are they both negative values, they're declining at basically the same rate. I mean, they both years, 2012 and 2016, saw pretty much equal separation between the candidates that year in terms of these voter ratios. So again, this ultimately won't make much of a difference as a tiebreaker in future elections. So let's toss all those graphs aside. My final consensus on Idaho is that it is a very, very Republican state, continuing to become, yes, more Republican. Although I have projected that Donald Trump will win by a smaller margin than he won in 2016, due largely in part to the fact that Hillary Clinton was pretty historically unpopular, I don't see Donald Trump dragging the state away from its very Republican standing at this point. Regardless of whether or not we have more Trump in our future or less Trump in our future, I expect Idaho to be this way for a very, very long time. That just about does it for our latest episode of Elections by Numbers. I want to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in today. If you like what you saw, please hit the subscribe button to get updates on new content as it becomes available. I upload videos every Monday and Thursday. I'm also on Twitter and I update that account with which state I'm covering next ahead of the scheduled release date, so if you want to stay ahead of the curve, please give me a follow on Twitter, and that link is in the description. Thanks again for watching. Thank you for voting. See you next time.